Thank you, Josh. I love that. I've been thinking a lot about those words, well done. And by the way, this morning on Easter Sunday, we're talking about coming alive to your purpose. And when you come alive to your purpose, then that day will come when God says to you, well done. I've been thinking a lot about Josh's words in that song because just a month ago, my father passed away. And Josh came out. I was with my father in Africa when he passed away, but then we had the service in Mississippi, and Josh came out and he sang those words. And of all the people that I know, I think my father has done it well. I think my father, thank you for... I watched him my whole life come alive to his purpose. And I say that because his life pretty much started after he served in the U.S. Navy in World War II. He had been a business major at San Jose State, so he moved back to San Jose. And his father invited him to come and work in the family business growing pears. And so my dad was just telling my sons again this last summer, he said, when I showed up the first day to work on the pear orchards, I showed up in a suit and a tie because I'd been a business major at San Jose State. He said, when my grandfather saw me, he said, Jack, what in the world are you doing in a suit? He said, well, I'm here for work, Dad. And he says, well, you better go change them because you're going to be outside in the orchard with a shovel and pruning shears, driving a tractor, building berms and doing irrigation. That's your job, not sitting in an office. So he went out and he worked like crazy for the next 10 years. And he took over the family business and grew like a pear empire in the Bay Area. And they were doing so well, my mom and my dad even built this big sprawling house in the middle of the orchard, and it was featured in a San Francisco Glamour magazine. And then one day after about 10 years in the orchards, my dad said he was pruning some of the prune trees, and he heard God speak. He said, as clear as you can hear the sound coming through the speaker right now, God spoke. And God said, Jack, leave the orchard and serve me. He said he was stunned. He dropped the shears and he took off running to our house. And he got to his house and he said to my mom, Nell, he said, God just spoke to me. And he said, leave the orchard and come and serve me. And she said this, she said, it's about time. She said, I've been praying for that. And my mom's here right now. Mom, it's good to have you at the Grove on Easter Sunday. Anyway, they left the orchard. People thought he had lost his mind and he went to seminary. He left a lucrative business and went to seminary and then moved to Africa with our family. And he founded 3 Christian universities in West Africa and South Africa and East Africa with thousands and thousands of graduates now. I think that's the kind of thing that happens when we find our purpose. This Easter Sunday, I want to invite you to find your God-given purpose. So if you have your Bibles, open up to John chapter 20, and the Easter story starts there. And when you start reading the gospel accounts of Easter morning, it's a jam-packed, exciting moment. All kinds of crazy things are happening. We have an earthquake, a stone is rolling, angels are showing up, a body is missing, no one knows where it went. People are crying, and that's how it starts. On the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. Verse 14, she turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she did not recognize him. And he asked, woman, why are you crying? And who is it you're looking for? Thinking he was a gardener, she said, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him. And he says, Mary. And she says, Rabboni. She says, teacher. So Jesus comes alive. Mary sees him and she doesn't recognize him. It's kind of a bummer when you come back from the dead and even your friends don't know who you are. That's not so good. But Mary doesn't recognize, when we keep reading the gospel accounts of his closest disciples, don't recognize him. Why is this? Theologians talk about the transfiguration of Jesus Christ. It's the same Jesus, but he's changed. It's the same Jesus, but he's new. It's the same Jesus, but he's different. You see, in this Easter story, we see the the story of our own spiritual transformation, the change that God wants to work in our lives, that when we give our lives to Him, that we do not remain, we do not stay the same kind of people. When you read the Bible, it uses this word transform over and over to talk about how we are made new, how the old has died and we become brand new kind of people. I think all of us as human beings, we love transformation stories. Because when we hear or we see a transformation story, then we think, well, maybe I can change. Maybe there's hope for me. That's why I think right now, maybe the leading genre in movies has to be Marvel Avengers, right? The DC movies. There's about one a week coming out of some obscure Marvel figure who we've never heard of. I actually read comics and collected comic books. I've never heard of Deadpool and Ant-Man, but now there's movies about them. But why do we like these movies? Because I think they're stories of transformation. An ordinary high school student becomes a superhero. That's how the stories go. For example, you have the son of a lighthouse keeper. His name is Arthur. He becomes Aquaman, king of Atlantis. And then you have this crippled medical student, pre-med student. His name is Donald Blake, and he becomes Thor, guardian of the universe. You have Jean Grey. Jean Grey, her father is just a history professor, but she becomes Marvel Girl Phoenix, another superhero. And then, of course, we have T'Challa. T'Challa is from Africa, and T'Challa is strong and young. T'Challa is from this place called Wakanda. Thank you very much. Can we go ahead and just do that for a minute? Anyway, he's from Wakanda, and he becomes the superhero Black Panther. And in every story, we see these transformations of ordinary people become superheroes. Well, the Bible has stories kind of like that to show us what happens in our lives. The only difference is the stories of transformation in the Bible, they're actually true. Now, don't get me wrong here. People that go to Comic-Con also think Marvel and DC stories are true. But that's a different sermon for another day. That's okay, if that's you. But the Bible keeps telling us that you can change, we can change. I have this key idea on the screen this morning. I hope this thought sticks with you. Our hope in Jesus Christ is that ordinary people can be changed in extraordinary ways and live with God-given purpose. You see, I think when God changed you, this Easter story is about you changing from the old person to a brand new person, that then we find our God-given purpose. When the Bible talks about transformation, it often uses this Greek word metamorpho. Metamorpho, it means this. It means to be transformed. It means to become completely changed. And from the Greek word metamorpho, we get our English word metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is a change of the form. This is a definition of form or nature or thing or person. To become completely different, either by natural or supernatural. I love that means. Now, when we hear the word metamorphosis, the English for the Greek word metamorpho, what do we usually think of? We almost always think about the caterpillar to the butterfly story. This phenomenal change of this crawling caterpillar becomes a flying butterfly. Now, if you've been to school at all, let's say at least through 4th grade, then you know that there's 3 stages of the butterfly story. And I think of all the creatures in the world, maybe the butterfly is the most fascinating in its life stages. The first stage, of course, is it crawls. It's a caterpillar. It's creeping and crawling everywhere, right? And the thing is, kids like butterfly, nobody likes caterpillars, all right? Some of them are venomous, like the pus caterpillar, that's a thing. But nobody likes caterpillars, it's just creepy and crawling. But then you have, second, the pupa stage, the cocoon. And the caterpillar forms this cocoon or this chrysalis, and it's in there for 2 weeks. And for 2 weeks, amazing, phenomenal things are happening inside the cocoon. And then at the 2-week mark, it breaks out, and out comes a butterfly, and it starts to fly. That's the stages of the butterfly. Thinkers in spiritual formation say we also have 3 stages of transformation. I want to look at those this morning. The first one happens like this. The first one is the old you has to die. The old part of you has to die. And let's go back to our Easter story, John chapter 20, verse 1. And we read, early on the first day of the week while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. And we'll just pause there for a minute. Because if you think about it, Easter starts rather bleak. It starts at a tomb. The Messiah is dead. He's buried in a cave. It's the dark night. It can't get any worse than this. But here's the thing. The tomb was necessary. But the Easter story, you have Jesus dying on a cross, and then he's buried, and we think, well, why does that happen? But then he rises again. And the cross and the death is necessary, even though we don't like that part of the story, because that's where our past, all of our wrongs, die with him on the cross. Everything that has happened in our life that is an offense to God is gone and dead. And then, like the caterpillar in the cocoon, for 3 days he's in the tomb, and that change happens to us as well. Old things have to die. They say that the caterpillar in the chrysalis, like it almost is completely gone before it starts to form into a butterfly. I think for us, there are old things in our lives that need to die. And maybe this morning on Easter Sunday, maybe it hits you that you have been keeping things alive in your life that it's time to let them die. Maybe you've been breathing life into the wrong things and they need to die. Maybe there's an attitude or a behavior that needs to die. Maybe there's a habit that's turned into an addiction that you need to let die. Maybe there's a bias or a prejudice that you hold in your heart. Maybe it's time to let that die. Or maybe there's a relationship, a person that you know is the most unhealthy relationship, the most unhealthy person for you. Then you have to let that relationship, that friendship die. Because until the old in us dies, we can never become the new, brand new kind of person that Jesus came to make us. And that leads me to the next thought, and it's this, that it's time to get out of the cave. And that's what we see on Easter morning. Let's pick up at the end of verse 1. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Jesus rises from the dead. And what does he do? He gets up and he gets out of there. He's not waiting for anyone. He shoves the stone out of the way and he escapes. In Duck Dynasty, they would say, he gone. He gone. He just gone. You know, we don't know where he is. Everybody's looking for him, but he's gone. Because who wants to stay in the cave if you can get out? If you've been in a dark place like a cave, it's time to get out. It's time to leave that place. Plato, about 2,400 years ago, 400 years before Christ, used to tell a story about life. And he says this, he says, imagine 3 people trapped in a cave their entire life. And he says they're chained and they're facing a wall. And we can imagine it's like Matt Liu's painting here is our wall. Matt, can we thank Matt? He's just phenomenal, Matt. Love everything you're doing. By the way, he did the art on our bulletin cover, the art outside. Thank you for being here. Anyway, so he says there's 3 prisoners chained in a cave, and they're facing this wall, and all they can see on the wall are shadows. Behind them is a fire in the cave, so they get a little bit of light, and people pass by the fire, even donkeys, animals, dogs, and people, and they see a reflection, a shadow on the wall. These 3 people growing up in the cave their whole life, they think that's the entire human existence. That's all that's out there. That's all that we know is this 2-dimensional gray shadows on a wall. But then one day, one of these 3 prisoners breaks free of the chains and runs out of the cave. And this guy comes out of the cave, Plato says, and he sees blue skies, and he sees trees with fruit. He sees green grass and flowers and butterflies and birds. And he's going, I can't believe it. I thought the cave was all there is. And now look at this amazing world, 3-dimensional world out here. He runs back in the cave and he tells the other 2 prisoners, you've got to get out. And he starts to free them. And they resist. They say, no, this is our home. This is where we're supposed to be. He says, no, you don't understand. Out there, there's a stunning, beautiful world, so much better than this little cave we've been locked in. And they actually attack him until he leaves alone and he leaves them in the cave. I think sometimes we get comfortable in our dark places, in the wrong places. Easter is your morning to come out of the cave. The thing is, if you think about it, we've all put in time in the cave, and maybe you're there right now. I think the cave is where our dreams die. The cave is where you've had it all, and then you lose it. I think the cave is when you're losing a friend a day. The cave is when you have to leave your own home. The cave is where the people you love the most, now they're hurting you the worst. The cave is where you want to give up on life and give up on everything and end it all. That's the cave, though, is not just about our body or our emotions. It's also about our soul. The cave is when you are far from God. The cave is when you are at odds with God's plan. The cave is when your heart is a million miles from heaven. But here's the thing about the cave. As much as we don't like it, I want to remind you this morning that those dark nights and dark places that I'm describing as a cave today, that God is doing something in that. In our culture, in our society, we're told, avoid pain, avoid suffering, avoid trouble for all you're worth. But here's the thing. So often the Bible teaches us that God is using the pain in life, using the trouble to grow us and to shape us into new kinds of people. For example, in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 30, we read, sometimes it takes a painful experience for us to change our ways. It's like the 2 weeks that the butterfly or the caterpillar spends in the cocoon. For 2 weeks, it's being changed. And the cocoon seems constricting and claustrophobic, but it's being metamorphosed. It's being metamorphosed. It's being changed into something good and beautiful. I think this brings us to the last thing that I hope you will take home, this last thought today. And it's your invitation to get out of the cave and come alive to your purpose. I think God gives all of us a God-given purpose. And the question for you this morning is, have you found it? Easter is a come alive to your purpose story. We have an illustration of it, in my opinion, an example of it in the life of Peter. So we've been in John chapter 20. Turn over one page in your Bible to John chapter 21. And in John chapter 21, we read a come alive to your purpose story. We read this. After coming alive, Jesus appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and he sees Peter, Nathanael, and the sons of Zebedee. And Peter says, I'm going out to fish. And they said, we'll go with you. How interesting is this? Byron talked about it 2 weeks here at the Grove. He talked about how Peter had denied Christ 3 times. But now, after failing Christ, where does he go? He goes back to his boat. He goes back to where he was before he knew Christ. His cave was in the shape of a boat. And I think sometimes we do this. I think sometimes we try to go back to the way things used to be. We think it was better back then, or we go back to old habits. We go back to old addictions. We go back to old relationships, the worst ones for us. And that's where Peter is. Let's keep reading, though. It doesn't end there. Verse 4. So they went out and they got in the boat, and that night they caught nothing. And then Jesus stood on the shore early in the morning, and the disciples did not even recognize him. So again, it's because he's been transfigured. Then the disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. And as soon as Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his garment around him and he jumped in the water. And Peter rushes to Christ. And Christ does this. He says, sit down with me at a fire. This is Peter's come to Jesus moment, all right? And that's what happens here. And they sit down around the fire. And he starts asking, and he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, you know I love you. He says, Peter, he asks him 3, do you love me? And Peter starts to cry, so frustrated. Of course, you know that I love you. And then Jesus says this, feed my sheep. This is your purpose. Your purpose isn't to fish. There's nothing wrong with fishing or growing pears, but I have something bigger. I have something better. Go out and feed my sheep. Make more followers of Jesus Christ. Spread his kingdom on earth. That's your purpose, Peter. And you know what Peter does? He comes alive to his purpose, and he starts planting churches. He's a church planting machine. He's the father of the early church. The entire New Testament church starts because of Peter, because he comes alive to his purpose. And that's my challenge. That's my invitation to you this morning, is to come alive to your God-given purpose. Because maybe like you, like Peter, you've gone back to your place of comfort. Maybe you've been crawling. We've been talking about butterflies and caterpillars. Maybe you've been in a cocoon or in a cave or just crawling along, and God has something bigger, better. To use our butterfly illustration one last time, the monarch butterfly, I don't know if you know about this, but every spring they hatch all over the United States and Canada. And then they eat milkweed all summer, as much as they can eat. And then when it starts to get cold, the monarch butterfly takes off and starts to fly. And they don't stop flying for 2,000, they stop at night to sleep. They don't stop flying for 2,000 miles south. From as far away as Canada, they fly to the Michoacan state in Mexico, and they land in the fir trees by the tens of millions. See, I'm not making this up. There's pictures of them. This is in Michoacan. And they come by the thousands to this forest. But can you imagine this? This creature that was crawling on the ground as a caterpillar comes out of its shell and it flies 2,000 miles, speeds up to 30 miles an hour. And then you know what it does after spending the winter in Mexico? They fly back north, 2,000 miles, back to Canada, back to North America, and then they reproduce by the thousands, by the millions they reproduce. Do you see why I say the butterfly story tells your story and my story of transformation, becoming people filled with purpose who change this world for good? And maybe you're here this morning and you're saying to yourself, well, I don't know what my purpose is. Well, maybe start here. Start here. What is so important to you? What is so valuable? What is so great that you would give your one and your very important life to it? Then go after that. Your purpose, I believe, will be the place where your abilities and your passions come together, and then God uses them to spread his kingdom on earth for good. When you see those three things happening, your passions and your God-given abilities come together and you start spreading his kingdom on earth, then you know you're in your sweet spot. Here's the thing, when you know your purpose, it changes the way we live. It changes the way you get out of bed. When you know your purpose, you get out of bed focused north. You're laser focused on your day. And you're excited that the alarm just went off, okay? It doesn't matter what time it is. You're happy about it because you've got a day to pursue your passions and your giftedness and to change this world for God. When you know your purpose, all of a sudden, it gives your life direction. It gives your life meaning. It makes every day count. It energizes you. When you know your purpose, it inspires you and you inspire others and you form a tribe and you start to change this world for good.